For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Gary Painter, and I serve as the director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you today for our virtual symposium on unsheltered homelessness. As is shown on the slide deck, we want to share our mission with you. And our mission as HPRI is to accelerate equitable and culturally informed solutions to ending homelessness here in LA County by advancing knowledge and fostering transformational partnerships between research, policy, and practice. It is in that spirit that we conduct quarterly symposia on topics that our community members, whether they are in policy, practice, or research, have uplifted as pressing and an opportunity for us to learn and to improve and to ultimately achieve the goal of ending homelessness. Saba, let me turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Saba Mwine, and I serve as HPRI's Managing Director. And it is our custom to, as we gather on a regular basis at this symposia, or as we gather as a collective of researchers, policymakers, service providers, and people with lived experience, that we acknowledge the land on which we stand. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, and acknowledge the presence that we're on their ancestral and unceded territory. And that is the territory of the Chumash, Kizh, and Tataviam nations. And we recognize and are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and communities. We pay respects to our ancestors, elders, our relatives and relations, and those ancestors represented by each of you on this call today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of this tree and the presence of nature and the presence of the land, again, that we all share as a very relevant and player in this subject of unsheltered homelessness. And so I just want to take a moment to briefly overview our agenda today. We are very, very happy and excited to have two research teams that will present their work, followed by a brief Q&A, and then we will go into our service and policy practice panel, and we will have our final Q&A after that. Thank you. And we also want to draw your attention to our social media and the conversation that we will be having on Twitter. So we have our conversation here. We have one in the chat. We invite you to chat with us on this Zoom chat. But then we also invite you to go into our chat on Twitter at HPRI_LA and follow us and be sure to be with us beyond this session. And before I pass it back over to Gary, this topic is really one that we find to be extremely pressing, not only as a city, but across the country. We are understanding unsheltered homelessness as one of the most urgent issues in our society. And as we think about our work at the intersection of race and culturally informed solutions to homelessness, understanding that race is a cause and driver of homelessness, I would be remiss to not bring to this conversation the recent racist attack on elders in Buffalo, New York. And I want to invite all of us on this call to reflect on what is the safety of Black and brown bodies in our society, and how does this inform our shared learning space that we have the privilege of having today, our shared learning space here and the conversation that we have here on unsheltered homelessness. And so this is just an opportunity for us to acknowledge that driver and to have these conversations with you, our community. And with that, I would just like to pass it to Gary to take us into the symposium.
Thank you, Saba, and thank you for reminding us the need to reflect on the seriousness of both the reasons why and who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And I think to that end, I wanted to start off with just a few reminders. There's many reasons why this issue is just so important. I think first and foremost is the high percentage of people who are unhoused that actually die on the streets. The figures reported by the New York Times that during the first year of the pandemic, there was an increase of 56% people dying in LA County because they were living on the streets. No matter what the exact number is, I think we all agree that having 3 or 4 or 5 people die a day living on the streets is just untenable, and we have to do much more than we're doing already. And while some of our conversations and debates are going to, range from, potentially the reasons why and what we can do about that, I know that we're going to end the conversation without all the answers. It will be incomplete. But we invite all of you to continue to walk with us at the Homelessness Policy Research Institute so that we can do a better job at serving all of our community members here in LA County and beyond. I think some of the questions that have come up in the mayor's race are particular import, and some of the policy actions recently, particularly in the city of Los Angeles. And I think many of you may have come to our conversation today to learn more, what kinds of actions to move people from a particular encampment to housing have been effective. Have they been done in a trauma-informed way? Have they been effective in terms of long-term housing placements? Why do some people provide some resistance to particular kinds of housing offers, and under what circumstances? Are those housing offers actually viewed by unhoused residents as potentially harmful relative to where they are living today? Again, these are just some of many questions that will be addressed today. And as Saba said, we were very privileged to have really an all-star panel, both of scholars and researchers, of people who are doing work, engaging with unhoused neighbors every day, and people who have had experience as someone who's unhoused as well. So it's my distinct pleasure to get us going. The bios of all of our participants are on the web. I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Hunter and Dr. Jason Ward to present their research, which many of you saw highlighted in the LA Times recently.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gary, for that introduction. And thanks for everyone for participating in the presentation today. I think you can use the chat feature if you have any comments or questions about the presentation as we go on. And then, as you know from the agenda, we'll have time at the end to have a more open discussion. Saba outlined how homelessness is one of our most pressing policy issues in LA, especially unsheltered homelessness. We're going to tell you a little bit about our interim findings from a report where we sought to provide a better understanding of the extent of street homelessness in 3 LA neighborhoods, more specifically Hollywood, Skid Row, and Venice, and also provide information about the demographics, housing experiences, needs, and preferences among the unsheltered in these places. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason, who's going to tell you a little more about the policy space that helped motivate our study.
The study that we undertook beginning last fall was primarily motivated by the emergence over 2021 and into the present of a lot of sort of ad hoc policies around dealing with homeless encampments. Many of you are probably familiar with these, but to briefly summarize, one of the events that really drew our attention was the proposed Carter order for the lawsuit around Skid Row last April, which would have required the city and county to house everyone on Skid Row within about 6 months. As attendees here likely know, this approach would have marked a dramatic shift from an acuity or needs-based prioritization approach to a geographic prioritization of generally very scarce housing resources. Another pair of key events that sort of furthered this shift to a geography-based approach in the city were the high-profile and really quite different approaches to clearing encampments in Echo Park and the Oceanfront Walk in Venice. In general, this sort of shift toward just basically trying to deal with areas that had become sort of politically problematic or really salient in that way just struck us as an approach that had the potential to sort of just shift a lot of people around in a way that might not have been particularly productive, and that maybe didn't really address the kind of longstanding problems that are at the root of why these places have sort of become politically problematic. And then finally, and most recently, the city's new 4118 anti-camping policy, which was quickly debated and enacted in late 2021, sort of gave this sort of council member specific ability to designate areas as off limits to camping, and was really enacted without a clear path to enforcement or to sort of making the required offers of housing and so forth. And to date, both the use of this ordinance to designate locations and the enforcement seem to have already begun to vary dramatically across different council districts. So all these events serve to highlight to us the lack of current data on the unsheltered population outside of the annual PIT count and demographic survey that conducted each January, which was as you all likely know, not conducted in the prior year. And essentially this lack of information sort of resulted in a lot of what seemed like potentially not well-informed policymaking, and coverage even in the media. For example, at the time of the Carter order, in different media accounts, estimates of the number of people that might be affected on Skid Row sometimes differed by thousands. And, a lot of high-profile plans to address encampments associated with the 4118 ordinance and associated with mayoral campaigns recently have sort of put forth a lot of plans that may run into the hundreds of millions of dollars without really any clear evidence on the housing needs and preferences of unsheltered people that would be affected. And so we just believe that an effort to try to fill some of these knowledge gaps would be really valuable. That led us to produce this the study that Sarah just introduced. And essentially we conducted systematic counts in 3 neighborhoods that Sarah mentioned, starting in late September of 2021. These counts in the report that we're going to show you results from now went through the end of January, but the counts themselves are ongoing. I'll give you a little sense of more of the methodology we used here. As Sarah mentioned, we focused primarily on these 3 neighborhoods, Skid Row, Hollywood, and Venice. To decide on the exact areas that we would survey, we basically conducted a series of site surveys in each of these areas to get a sense of the areas of greatest concentration of encampments. And then we also worked with service providers and city council staff in some of these areas to try to identify the sort of more hotspot areas to make sure that essentially we surveyed the areas that would give us the best sense of what was going on, but sort of were able to maximize the use of our project resources, particularly in terms of extending the amount of time we could do this for by sort of trading off between time and geography. We tried to introduce a number of facets of variation to sort of assess how these things may matter, which I think that hasn't really been super well understood in the past. So for instance, well, first off, we sort of counted more intensively in Skid Row due to the higher density of people there. We conducted counts there every 2 weeks. We conducted counts once a month in Hollywood and Venice Beach. Each time we alternated days of the week and days of the month. So we essentially were trying to see if, there's certain days of the week when there are more or fewer people for various reasons related to potentially services or receiving monthly funds or things of that nature. We also varied our counts each time between an AM and a PM shift. So in the AM shift, we would count from about 6 to 9 when many people were already sort of where they were going, where they had been sleeping for the night, but they were still there, I should say. And then in the evening, we count from about 9 to midnight to try to generally catch people where they were sort of going to be settling down, and just to try to reduce the amount of sort of double counting from, say, walking around when unsheltered people themselves might have been walking around. Our enumerations, depending on the neighborhood, mixed walking shifts, which was all we conducted in Skid Row, driving shifts, which is what we conducted exclusively in Hollywood, and then in Venice Beach, where we did sort of a mixture of driving and walking. We had a team of up to 8 or 9 field workers that conducted all these studies in common. So they were trained prior to deploying the survey extensively, and then they became pretty expert over time. Many of our great crew we had out there had worked previously in service provision for people experiencing homelessness or other aspects, and generally had a pretty great understanding of these populations and sort of a high comfort level in terms of approaching people and so on, which we think really helped us. Additionally, we responded, once we kind of started planning the study, we responded to developments at the VA campus in Brentwood. And as it became apparent in around October that there was going to be a sort of a rapid effort to try to clear the sidewalk encampment there and either house people offsite or move people onto safe camping or tiny homes in the campus itself, we incorporated some measurements there. We basically made 2 enumerations there before the clearing sort of got heavily underway. And then we also conducted 1 round of surveys, which I'll discuss the surveying in a moment, but we made it there once and got 12 respondents from this area as well into our mix of respondents. And basically the results I'm going to show you here today, what we did is we counted it much in the way the LAHSA PIT count is conducted. We counted individuals, we counted vehicles, including cars, vans, and RVs. Then we counted tents, and we actually counted tents in 3 different sizes: tents and makeshift shelters. Small, which we defined as 6 feet or under, kind of like a single person tent; medium, which we defined as 6 to 12 feet; and then large, which we defined as 12 feet or over. And we just did this to kind of get a sense of how, the incidence of these different kinds of structures of different sizes and so forth varies around these sites and over time. So we just thought it would be interesting to track this kind of stuff. The results I'm going to show you today simply count all these things up one for one. So we're really just going to show you a sum without any sort of weighting or anything. Our sort of back of the envelope take is that using the 2020 LAHSA weighting would approximately inflate these estimates by about 30%. But in a later report, we're going to sort of explore the implications of weighting and so forth in a little more detail. But for now, we just sort of made a straight, this is what we counted, add them all up kind of an approach. Additionally, we conducted a set of surveys that were very similar in some respects to the demographic survey conducted by LAHSA in the project that Ben and Randall are heavily involved in order to sort of introduce some randomization to our surveying, we used a skip rule. It basically such that we approached every 3rd person in Skid Row that we encountered and offered to survey them, and we approached every other person in Hollywood and Venice just due to the lower density of people we encountered there. These individuals were offered $5 cash incentive to take about a 10 to 15 minute survey. It was administered by our field workers on paper after the individuals who expressed interest received an eligibility screening that identified them as literally homeless. And in that screener, we also collected some information that I'm not going to present here, but that we plan to use in the future about, do they live in a different kind, a tent, makeshift shelter, vehicle, how many other people share that with them, and so forth. And we can link that back to our surveys as well. That we collected 216 responses that we're going to show you the results of in this report. It was about 100 from Skid Row, about 50 each from Venice and Hollywood, and then, as I mentioned, about a dozen from Veterans Row. Since that time, we've collected more than 400 surveys in total. And just as a spoiler alert, none of the results we're going to show you here have changed dramatically. So we sort of view that as a mark of confidence of the generalization to some extent, at least within these neighborhoods, of what we found. We had a very high response rate. In these 216 surveys, our overall response rate was greater than 80%. By the time we got to over 400, our response rate was closer to 85%. So we had a remarkably good experience in terms of, getting people to take the survey once they were approached. Yeah, so as I mentioned, these are just basically the sums of those categories. So the graph here shows the time series of data for our counts for this first 4 months of the study. On the x-axis is time expressed in months and years, and then on the y-axis are just the raw sum of these different things that we were counting. As can be seen, our numbers fluctuate from count to count. This is particularly true in Skid Row. You can see this one particularly outlier number that we counted in mid-December roughly, which appears to have maybe been the result of the fact that a neighborhood-wide COVID-19 testing and vaccination event was happening when we did the count that day. It was about 20% larger than the counts that came before and after it. But we think in general, that kind of an event shows the importance of counting over multiple periods of time to sort of see how much it matters, at the specific time and day that you sort of walk up and try to get a sense of the population in these areas. We did not find a strong pattern of variation related to counting in the morning, at night, or at night. If you look at each of these rows, each line, the first point is in the AM, and then we alternate PM, AM, et cetera. So the only place you can see where there's maybe some modest variation is in Hollywood, where generally the 2 night shifts had higher numbers than the day shifts. But in other areas, there wasn't a similar pattern evident. We counted around, on average, 1,300 people, vehicles, and tents and makeshift shelters in Skid Row, around 650 in Hollywood, and around 500 in Venice. Just to give a sense of the geography, our Skid Row geography was fairly compact. We used a geography that's was provided to us by an area service provider that's a bit smaller than what is counted as Skid Row in the past LAHSA counts. We stuck to an area that was pretty much central Hollywood. We didn't count a lot. We didn't cross over far into East Hollywood. And then in Venice, we also had a fairly central geography in Venice, where we basically stayed west of Lincoln and went to the oceanfront walk. Overall, the numbers that we counted here increased on average by about 17%. We would hesitate to assert that these represent a significant long-term trend, because obviously you'd sort of get to astonishingly high numbers of people if you were growing at roughly 4 or 5% a month. However, just to sort of preview what's happened since this time, we've seen some mean reversion in terms of these numbers in Skid Row and in Hollywood, though in general, they are still trending modestly upward. In Venice Beach, we've seen a fairly meaningful upward trend in the counts that has actually continued to the present, such that I think we've gone from about 600 to closer to 650 or 700 people, vehicles, and tents and makeshift shelters over that period. But in a future report, we'll sort of break this down and think about the statistically meaningful nature of these trends, or the lack thereof. I'll turn now to some of the survey findings. I'll tell you a little bit about this, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah to go into some detail about housing needs and preferences. In demographic terms, the composition of our survey respondents are broadly similar to what was found in 2020 LAHSA data on dimensions like age and gender. The vast majority of unsheltered individuals we contacted were between 25 and 54. 70% were men. These things have been pretty steady in the data in the LA area in the past. One difference we found from the 2020 LAHSA data is a significantly higher number of Black African American unsheltered individuals. We counted about 50%. I believe this was about a 35 to 40% higher level than was found in 2020 in LAHSA. There are some differences between our data and the LAHSA data, including that we don't wait for survey non-response, though as I mentioned, our non-response rates were quite low. The other meaningful difference was that we found a lower rate of individuals identifying as Hispanic relative to the last LAHSA data that we were able to look at. We asked a number of questions about the duration of homelessness experienced by respondents. Over 3/4 of them reported being continuously homeless for more than a year, with over half reporting a span of 3 years or more. Over 3/4 of our respondents also reported being in the area we surveyed them for more than 6 months. In terms of where respondents were before we encountered them, we asked, about, we actually just gave them a free form answer for that, which we recoded into some broad categories as best we could. Around 2/3 reported being elsewhere in LA County, and nearly 80% reported being in California. This again is pretty similar to past findings from the LAHSA demographic survey, and suggests that, as we all generally have been learning, the homelessness phenomenon here is pretty much of a homegrown phenomenon. I'll show you a few results on mental health and substance abuse. Nearly half reported having ever been told they had a chronic physical health condition. More than half reported ever being told they had a chronic mental health condition. These results suggest that a substantial portion of our respondents have significant needs in these areas, which is important for a number of policy issues, including the pending settlement of the Carter lawsuit by the city, which currently hinges on providing housing for those without significant mental and physical health care needs, which the city is asserting is the responsibility of the county. In terms of substance use patterns and disorder, 20% of our respondents reported ever being told they had a substance use disorder, but we see higher levels of respondents reporting regularly using hard drugs like heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, or prescription opioids, suggesting that maybe our question about a substance use disorder may be conservative. And it may also have to do with the fact that people have been on the streets for too long to have really had much contact with the service providers, and may have developed these problems in the long periods of time they've been living unsheltered. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah to talk about what we found about housing needs and preferences.
Thanks, Jason. So as you can see on the slide here, we found that around 90% of the respondents told us they were interested in obtaining housing. We also asked each of our participants what sort of housing option they would accept. And we gave them 9 options, including, as you see here, safe camping, group shelter, bridge housing, transitional or interim housing, recovery sober living housing, permanent stay in a motel or hotel-like setting, shared housing, and supportive housing. And for some of these options, we provided further clarification. For example, we defined bridge housing as temporary shelter with on-site services, and supportive housing as one's own apartment with case management. As you can see, the majority of participants indicated interest in staying in a setting where they had their own private room or space. And about half of participants indicated they would accept transitional or interim housing, safe camping, or shared housing. And about 1/3 were interested in group shelter, or recovery, or sober living. We also asked participants what factors had prevented them from moving in to housing in LA since they had become homeless. And again, we had 12 options, and provided them also an opportunity to express another issue not previously mentioned. And the most common response that we heard was never being contacted for move-in by 43% of respondents. Other frequently endorsed factors were lack of privacy or sense of safety in the housing options available, and also issues regarding paperwork, hours, curfew, housing location, and cleanliness. And while there's been, other stories written about the lack of the 3 Ps, pets, possessions, and partners, that didn't seem to be, a real issue among the sample, suggesting perhaps that LA is doing generally a good job in accommodating for those factors. We found that about half our sample told us they'd been offered some sort of housing since they've become homeless in LA. And about a third reported they were currently on a wait list for housing. I'm going to turn over to Jason to talk more about the policy implications related to our findings.
So our latest count data suggests there's a large amount of fluctuation over time in the size of the visible population of unhoused individuals, though we see some evidence, as I mentioned, of a more secular increase in Venice. So we think that the evidence we're showing here may bear on the deployment of resources across areas of the city and on the future of attempting to enforce policies like the city's 4118 anti-camping ordinance, or to live up to the potential settlement that the city's proposing for the Carter order, or for the Carter, overseen lawsuit. The responses we got about saying that a key barrier to obtaining housing was never being contacted for move-in, to us points to what may be an addressable problem in the current system of housing provision, namely finding ways to dramatically shorten the time required to match eligible individuals with available housing, which is something the county seems to have become focused on in the plan they just released this last week. We also think that this may bear on issues around caseworker turnover and workload of caseworkers, and sort of managing these the expectations of what is needed of caseworkers, and also making sure that these jobs are jobs that people can sort of flourish and stay in, may be an important step to address this kind of timeline issue as well. Finally, our results suggesting a quite low level of interest in moving off the streets into group shelter settings may mean that plans that hinge on rapidly scaling up group shelters as part of enforcing anti-camping laws as proposed by the council and mayoral candidates may not make a large impact on reducing unsheltered populations living on the street. We noted that a much higher number of people indicated an interest in safe camping as a temporary housing option, which may be a cheaper and faster way to address these immediate needs. Though recent experiences, for instance, of outgoing Councilmember Mike Bonin's attempt to propose safe camping sites around West LA suggests that rapidly increasing either shelter or safe camping capacity may be a difficult process politically. As we mentioned, this study is ongoing. We believe it represents a potentially important resource for policy and transparency around this critical issue facing us all. We're currently exploring potentially finding permanent sources of funding to continue and expand this effort. And, we also welcome the chance to brief any relevant policymakers and stakeholders in more depth about this study and our findings, if any of you all have such contacts that might be interested. Our information is here. Thanks for your time and attention. I'll turn it back over to Saba for Nick.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Jason. I think there were a few questions in the chat, but I believe you can probably answer them vis-a-vis the chat while we turn the next research presentation over to a team of Dr. Ben Hinwood, Dr. Randall Kuhn, and Alexander Lawton. And I think that will kind of keep us on time. And please, again, check out the bios for our presenters. And you can, as you heard, they are on the forefront of the work here in LA County. And then we'll have a moment of kind of overall reflection of Q&A at the end of their presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Randall Kuhn from UCLA School of Public Health. I'm going to just take the lead here because time is limited and we have a lot of slides. But Ben and Alex can join in kind of as we go along. I just wanted to start with our efforts to build a longitudinal mobile survey of people experiencing homelessness and people entering into housing have evolved over the past few years and have really been pushed forward by a number of conversations around around the HPRI context through the Data Gaps group led by Patty St. Clair. We gave a talk sort of proposing this idea way back in the before times, and I think November 2019. So I also just wanted to track the evolution of sort of our framework for how we're envisioning how homelessness and unsheltered homelessness kind of get under the skin and affect health. And that is through this, and that is the pandemic has given us a much better understanding of this. I think that, as we've observed that COVID-19 mortality rates among PEH basically look like if you just accelerated death rates by 15 years ahead of the chronological age. We can increasingly understand the experience of homelessness as an experience of being exposed to multiple threats and insults that lead to weathering and accelerated aging, right? That break down the body, the blood, the bones, the cells, the systems of our body, of a person's body, resulting in premature mortality. Those things are, of course, also exacerbated by lack of access to healthcare and by the difficulties of, say, adhering to health treatments when you don't have a home or a refrigerator. And of course, these things all exist in the context of cumulative disadvantage, most notably a lifetime of exposure to structural racism, poverty, marginalization that precedes homelessness. And yet, when homelessness happens, that is a discrete event that involves many insults that if we are to understand what's going on, we need to understand what are the consequences of those insults. And so we're going to talk a fair bit about 4118, the camping ordinance, as potentially one of those insults. But let me just step back from that for a minute and say that the Homelessness Research Collaborative that is based at UCLA, USC, and Aikido Labs, we have this basic goal of creating a longitudinal, representative, and up-to-date data repository on homelessness in LA County, that the goal is really to have a large and ongoing panel survey, right? And a big part of this is a fundamental belief that you cannot understand the well-being of people under threat unless you have longitudinal data. And that if people's lives are vulnerable to multiple threats occurring in short time, that we need that data collection to occur at relatively short intervals. Really, in our minds, a month may not even be short enough. We did an initial pilot with Venice Family Clinic that we reported on last year, where we were able to enroll 130 people by SMS using their electronic health records into a survey. We did a lot of the piloting, recruitment, development of the survey platform using a trauma-informed survey design and figuring out critically how to deliver electronic incentives to a vulnerable population. We used those data from the Venice Family Clinic study to publish a paper on vaccine hesitancy among people experiencing homelessness, which provided a lot of critical real-time data on what the barriers to immunization were. 18 months later, we still have about half that sample answering surveys each month. And that was on most of them, for most of that period, they were on a $5 a month incentive model, which we're now at a $10 a month incentive. So we think that these numbers would potentially be even better, right? And that is part of the fundamental principle of a mobile longitudinal survey is you're going to not get everybody because not everybody has a phone, and you're going to lose some people along the way. But if you can weight those people properly, then what you've got is real-time monthly data on a relevant and hopefully representative panel. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't think I need to review 4118 for this crowd, just to say that it's a major concern that motivated us in coming to the Hilton Foundation to propose sort of phase 2 of what we're now calling PATHs, which is periodic assessment of trajectories of homelessness, housing, and health. So we got some leads and we got some paths. And in a way that sort of fits where the RAND study and our study are, which is that we're sort of following people out on their path from the locations. Whereas the RAND group is following the locations over time, we're following the people wherever they go. So the goals of this study were basically, the hope was that if we set this up right, that we could essentially do a baseline and a monthly survey and collect both general purpose data on how people's lives are unfolding as well as some data that is specifically relevant to current rehousing efforts and specifically relevant to 4118. So monthly, the goal was to get to an N of about 500, which we're quickly approaching. Monthly data were meant to be collected in kind of, again, the survey is the same every month, but the idea is it would be a survey that would be suitable to assessing people's housing and shelter needs, to monitoring the progress of where people are ending up, both whether they're going into interim housing, whether they're getting to permanent housing, and of course, tracking this leaf blower effect of is the ordinance just scattering people to different and potentially more vulnerable locations, say being scattered from city of LA into unincorporated county, things like that. And then looking at the impact for wherever you end up over time, what is your ultimate housing and health trajectory? So I won't go too much into the main research questions. I'll just add the other big one that we're thinking about is, are people who remain on the streets, particularly in the city of LA, going to be exposed to more aggressive levels of policing? Or we have questions on ticketing, arrests, and so on over time. And unfortunately, I'm not going to give that many results because we're still into the recruitment, but I want to give a flavor of what we've done, what the platform looks like. So this version of PATHS differs from the previous one in that in the previous one, we were recruiting people off electronic health records, which had some potential representativeness issues. In this case, we're recruiting people directly via the LA County Demographic Survey, which Ben Henwood leads that team. I'm part of that team. A number of people on the PATHS team are part of that team. And so after completing the LAHSA demographic survey, that is part of the homeless count, individuals were invited initially by card, but eventually by just an enrollment card, but later by a direct text message, basically asking them, can we send you a text message? We're asked to participate in this study. Recruitment has continued. We optimized the recruitment over the course of the demographic survey, which lasts 3 months. So as intended, we've continued to recruit following the end of the demographic survey using similar methods. That is, we still use the demographic surveys screening technique and recruitment techniques, but rather than routing them into the demographic survey, we route them directly into this study. But one of the advantages for the, say, 150 people who were recruited during the demographic survey is we can actually compare the sample, because one of the big concerns for a study like this is how do these people with mobile phones compare to the general population, that we can actually directly compare that by merging the people that we surveyed into the demographic survey. That's still to come though. Okay, so participants receive a short pre-screening survey for which they receive a $10 electronic gift card. Then if they're approved, which in most cases they are because they're recruited directly on the street, then they receive a baseline survey with a $10 electronic gift card and then monthly surveys. Again, I mentioned a big innovation of this project was the delivery of electronic gift cards that can be seamlessly delivered via email. That is a requirement of this study so far, is that you need to have an email to receive these electronic gift cards. These gift cards cover, I would say, a wider range of relevant vendors than, say, UCLA's only electronic gift card options at the time this study was developed were Amazon, which is really an insulting gift card option for people with no address, and Starbucks, which is nice. Sometimes you want, my kids love bacon, egg, and cheese Gouda sandwich, but right but this is a more relevant and varied set of options. These can be delivered electronically. Claim rates for the electronic gift cards are well into the 90% range, 95%. Whether they're not, we can't track how many of them are actually being spent. But again, the fact that claim rates are well into the 90s is very encouraging. Here's our engagement funnel that basically over the course since the start of the study, we've again, our teams have talked to many more people than this, but that is 600 people have completed the pre-screen survey. We now have 350 baselines completed. Actually, the actual baseline data you'll see are a little higher than that because this is from a couple weeks ago. recruitment is ongoing, and 250 have already completed the first monthly survey. That means a number of people are already into their third or fourth month, but the ends for that is pretty low still. So we're not going to report any results on that. The study data are a baseline survey that includes demographic and self-reported kind of life history, experiences of homelessness, and so on. And then monthly surveys address COVID-19, access to care, substance use, basic needs, policing, location, and again, housing preferences. Okay, really quickly through some baseline data. So I just want, this is kind of, we're doing this on the fly. We're still very early on, but I just wanted to do a comparison of the demographic composition of our sample to Pitt 2020. Because Pitt 20, we haven't done the direct comparison to Pitt 2022 yet. And that is our sample essentially looks like the 2020 Pitt sample. We have 27% African-American compared to 29%. We have a somewhat lower representation of Hispanic Latino. We understand why that is because we didn't initially have a Spanish language instrument or recruitment materials, and those will be going into the field in June. So we expect at that point that, again, just because our race breakdown lines up with the general homeless count, that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways in which we're not representative. But what we're recruiting is essentially a sample that looks in terms of race like the overall homeless population during the homeless count. We're a little bit different on sex gender. That is, women are overrepresented. I think this may come as not much of a surprise to a lot of people. Anywhere you look in the survey research field, if you have a kind of a survey model that depends somewhat on volunteerism, that you're going to get more women than men. We don't necessarily view this as a flaw because we can reweight our data to reflect, say, the higher propensity for females to answer the survey, because we've linked into the demographic survey. And of course, from a statistical power standpoint, we like the fact that we have almost as many women in the survey as men. We also like the fact that we have, over time, if this sample were large enough, we're getting a higher percentage of people who report other or non-binary gender, and that we might actually be able to do some meaningful statistical analysis for that population. Other characteristics, substance abuse disorder. One question about a study like this is a survey of people who have phones and have functioning phones and want to participate in this going to underrepresent individuals with a history of substance use? Based on comparing our question about have you ever been diagnosed with substance use disorder to the demo survey question from 2020, we see no difference on that. We do see a higher level of reports of physical health condition, but that's because we're using a different and more specific question that includes all of the conditions that are potentially comorbid with COVID-19. Okay, quickly into month one monthly data. So we talked to the RAND team a lot about what housing preference questions to use. I think our questions look pretty similar to theirs, with one exception that we'll get to. So in terms of which of the following housing would you be interested in receiving, right? We see very similar to their results that people would like a private room. And interestingly, half of them would like something with some kind of supportive services. Hotel, motel is very popular. Group shelter is really not popular, 2%. And again, we haven't yet tested how strong these preferences are. And I know that's something that Chris Weir and others have talked a lot about that we need to do, and something we would love to do. In terms of housing needs, so we separated our question on housing needs and preferences into what would keep you from moving into a shelter and what are your needs and requirements. So this is not the barrier of what kept you in the past from shelter. This is in forward-looking terms. Do you have any needs or requirements for housing and shelter? And this is, again, on a pretty large sample. This is now almost 300 people. We see, indeed, the 3 Ps come out on top. Possessions, 35%, partner, spouse, or child, 32%, pets, 27%. I kind of would add the 4th P, maybe, of place, that 19% also would like to be in a particular neighborhood. 9% mention handicapped accessible. Only 13% report no specific needs. In terms of barriers, again, I think these aren't surprising, but they're still interesting to see. 58% report that lack of privacy would keep them unsafe, cleanliness, bad hours, and negative interactions with staff. And this is potentially a powerful set of barriers. Okay. We also, again, I mentioned we want to be keeping track of this leaf blower effect. Are all these policies simply scattering people around? So we're trying to collect location, that is every month, track someone's change in location. As of month 1, we were able to get exact location, either a GPS ping or punching in your intersection that you're at for about half of the sample. For another half of the sample, people were willing to give neighborhood, and only about 6% were provided no location data at all. So this just gives an idea of where our sample is located. That is, they're everywhere. We get clusters in SPA 1, SPA 2, all over that roughly mirror the locations of the LA County homeless count. Now, as a result of that, because our sample is everywhere, we don't necessarily yet have a large percentage of our sample who are actually in 4118 enforcement zones. That is, we overlaid the locations of our sample with the buffer zones that LA City is now providing a updated map of locations and buffer zones for approved and posted 4118 enforcement areas. And what we're seeing is just under 10% of our sample are currently in an area with active 4118 enforcement. Of course, that doesn't say whether they won't be in an area where future postings happen, or whether they're in a town where we haven't tracked. There are a lot of towns out there like Inglewood, Arcadia, and so on that are also doing sweeps, and we haven't linked that in yet, but we will. Here's just perceptions of camping ordinance. So we asked some questions about, do you feel informed about the camping laws, and how are these laws making you feel? And these are the reports on whether someone agrees or strongly agrees with these statements. And we see I backwards coded this, sorry, the orange is City of LA, the blue is elsewhere, right? That the people in City of LA are about 10 to 20 points higher on their perception of how the camping law is going to affect them. So clearly everyone is aware of the camping law and perceives that it's potentially going to have an effect, and that it is making them nervous. But also we note that there's a gap in how informed people feel about what these laws really mean. Okay, next steps, really quickly. Recruitment will go on through June. Again, this is just a flavor of our results. Stay tuned for more. Spanish survey launching. Monthly data collection will continue throughout the year. We'll produce a preliminary report in summer, and we have a data visualization engine. You can already see the Venice Family Clinic sample visualization, the Tableau, at this website. The paths visualization will be going up very soon. We will be linking to the demo survey to try to understand the representativeness of our sample. We will be adding a questionnaire on victimization and experiences of hate from the experiences from people other than police, including the housed population. In terms of other future plans, we do have a big comparative study that links this survey to the PCHU's permanent supportive housing study that some people have heard about, to really try to do a really good job of saying, comparing those who were assigned to housing during the pandemic to those who weren't, what were the long-term trajectories of health and weathering? And finally, we're already looking forward to a larger recruitment in the 2023 homeless count. We'd like to get the sample up into more of the 1,000 range, perhaps with a year, not just sampling people during the winter and spring, but sampling people year round. We've learned a lot about how to recruit people into this study. So we'd love to work with folks like the RAND group on year-round sampling. We'd love to hand out phones to improve representativeness. All of this is obviously quite costly. So we are always open to talking to implementation partners and funding partners on ways to improve our technology and on ways to fund a larger survey. And the last thing I'll add is one of the big things we'd like to move towards is a model of a continuing panel with survey modules that could be inserted, could kind of come in and out, a modular approach where other research groups, partners, investigators could add their own questions and build on the corpus of this survey. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Randall, and thank you for your team for doing this fantastic work. I'm going to just uplift two quick questions for both teams, and then we'll move into our panel of providers, and then we'll have a longer Q&A session after. Again, I invite all the research panelists to share answers to things that we aren't able to cover in this context, just for time's sake in the Q&A and the chat feature. The question that there's two questions I wanted to uplift. There was a question around victimization, and Randall, you mentioned that maybe you don't have a question around that, either in terms of people who've been victimized prior to experiencing homelessness or since they've experienced homelessness. So that's number one. And then the number two question is, and this is related to the survey, but may not have been asked directly, was there any questions related in either of the surveys to what people were willing to do, what behavioral change might have been required to that they would actually engage in order to maintain housing? And so thinking about the old models of housing ready versus housing first. So either team can jump in just to answer those two questions briefly.
Yeah, I just want to iterate that we traded off doing a really brief survey versus doing an in-depth survey to try to keep it short, and so that people would accept our offer to do it. So our questionnaire was only about 30 questions, and it took about 10 to 15 minutes. People were allowed to either fill it out themselves or have it completed with the help of an administrator, and almost every person decided they would like it administered to them. So yeah, unfortunately, we didn't ask those questions. If we had an opportunity to do another round of survey, we would certainly plan to modify some of the questions based on what we learned with this first effort.
Randall, any comment on either of those questions from your team?
No, I mean, on the victimization, it's a really good point that in addition to ongoing victimization, it would be really helpful to have questions on history.
Great. All right, thank you both. Saba, I'm happy to turn it over to you to lead our distinguished panel.
Wonderful. Thank you all for presenting your work. And we're just going to jump right into kind of an opportunity for our panelists to reflect on what you presented. But I first want to say their names. I'm really pleased. We're really fortunate to be joined by Berlin Contreras, Senior Manager of Street-Based Access and Engagement at HPRI, William Jackson III, Special Teams Housing Navigator at Housing Works, and Colleen Murphy, Associate Director of Unsheltered Strategies at LASA. And pardon my scratchy voice. And we want to reiterate that and invite you all to check out our panel bios. They are available at a link that I will ask to be dropped once more. We dropped it earlier, but we'll drop it again now. So like I said, I just want to kind of start us off on just a general reflection, really, or specific things that stood out to you in listening to the two presentations that we heard. And I think I will ask Colleen to start us off with just your reflections on the research presented.
Thank you so much. And it's a real honor and privilege to be here today. In a former life, I was a researcher myself, so I always appreciate the work that goes into this. And so I just want to applaud, everyone for this hard work. And I think, there's always been a dearth of research in this area. And so I'm so appreciative when we can start to enumerate and be able to really quantify the things that we get to see every day, but tends to be anecdotal. So just my utter gratitude for sharing these important results. I think, the first presentation was interesting in that it shared, temporally things do not look the same, and so the work has to shift and is very, has to switch on a dime as things look differently. I think one of the pieces where it may have looked differently during late in the year also was we did see a phenomenon we had never seen where we were able to get a large number of people in Project Room Key and other interim housing sites. But when there were COVID quarantines at these sites, because of the precautions put in to keep people safe, sometimes that was not what people wanted, and so they would exit. And so we did see these fluctuations of moving large numbers of people in and then people leaving and then vice versa. And so, it's one of those things where not only is there seasonality to our street-based work, but also as new issues emerge, our approaches have to. And so I appreciate showing that and how our work has to shift to that work. I also appreciate just the conversation around, location-based strategies. And, there's an opportunity, but there are some drawbacks when we focus on specific encampments and understanding. And I think most importantly is the great voice of both presentations of those who we serve and people who are neighbors who happen to be unsheltered and getting what they want, what they need. And frankly, what they deserve is really critical. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. And so I'd like to give the opportunity for Berlin and then William to reflect on the research presented and how it sort of intersects and what are the connections between what we heard and your work.
Good morning, everybody. I will also like to thank everybody, all the researchers, for taking the time and, thoroughly thinking through all the questions that you guys are asking the participants, because a lot of the times people just assume that all questions meet the same criteria, but that it doesn't. So thank you for taking the time to for providing this or doing this research with the unsheltered population. I think one of the things that I liked during the presentations were the fluctuation between the AM and PM and trying to see if you can categorize everybody the same. I think for SPA 6, one of the things that changes a lot is the number of individuals that you see during the day and the night. You have individuals who work during the day, so you won't be able to count those specific individuals, and they come back at night, which is the times that our teams don't work. Another thing that I really liked during the second presentation were providing the technology to be able to find the locations and find and provide the research. Provide the service. It's something we haven't seen quite yet. I know that for Hopix particularly, we're working with Aikido Labs to roll something out in the near future. And we have started working with them to try to see if we can get individuals tied into medical services through telehealth and technology, trying to see how that works. And unfortunately, it hasn't worked quite well because of the individuals either sell the technologies that they have to make ends meet. But we haven't seen the research, but I'm actually excited to see how that's going to work in the near future. But those are two of the things that I really liked during this presentation earlier this morning. So I want to thank you guys once again for that, and I'll wrap up there.
Thank you, Berlin. William?
Good morning, everyone. So, thank you for having me here. And I feel like I could go through each one of those slides and just add commentary on each one, because, things come to mind for the different points of data that were shared. And to just kind of start somewhere in all of this, thinking about, starting with even the first slide of just like the tree, right? And just how and where the displacement of the indigenous people of this land acts as a precedent for the amount of homelessness that we see to this day. How is our treatment or mistreatment of the indigenous people of this land part of the shadow work that America and Americans need and should engage in, that could then trickle down, so to speak, into how that may relieve the amount of numbers and suffering we're seeing of homelessness in Los Angeles, right? And throughout the United States in general. So that's one of the first things that kind of came to mind, right? And then also to speak to one of the many points I'd like to make based on the slides and information that was shared, just talking about how a lot of these individuals, or if not a significant amount of them, have just kind of been lost in the system due to lack of employee retention, right? Like that's a serious factor in how many of these individuals are still out on the street because of, maybe lack of self-care practices in some of these agencies and organizations when it comes to their employees. This work, especially for those that are coming with lived experience, which I think is an asset for those that are engaging in outreach. But if the tools aren't being presented or shared with case managers to help them navigate, offset, and so forth, transform any of their own traumas that may come from working in this field and dealing with these individuals and the severe amount of sorrow and grief and so forth that you are dealing with these individuals, it can be overwhelming, right? It can be overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And if case managers are not furnished with the tools to help to transform or transmute all the stuff that they're surrounded by on a daily basis with their clients or those to whom that they're doing outreach, then yes, that can lead to those just simply saying, I want to do something else, or I want to be elsewhere, right? And then clients get lost in the mix. Someone else comes on, if someone else comes on to fill that position, and are they going to take back on those clients, or do they just get lost in the paperwork? And then so you still have people out on the streets months, years later, who were on track to get housing, but because their case manager decided to go elsewhere, needed to go elsewhere, they got lost. So that's definitely a significant portion, I think, of the discussion when it comes to getting people housed. And then, as another discussion or point to that one is having more individuals out there who come with lived experience, right? Because being able to engage in this realm of work with lived experience, but then also having best practices, can really increase the effectiveness, at which we are able to engage these individuals in a meaningful manner. And meaningful manner meaning approaching them on a level and in a way in which they know is genuine, right? This isn't just somebody coming to me and, they just want something, or who are they? And, why do they want my information and so forth? You can tell them, like, I've been where you are at, right? Like, I've been there. I have slept on the sidewalk. I have so on and so forth. And when I've shared my own lived experience with individuals to whom I'm meeting the first time, I've literally seen their shoulders drop. I have literally seen their guard drop and then them open up to me in a way in which they might not have to others who are not coming with that same experience, right? So communication and being able to translate lived experience into an effective methodology of engagement and outreach can really be a way in which we can bring people out of their own kind of barriers that they may have had to create due to the nature of the environment in which they're in, or in which they are indeed surrounded by insults, both environmental and the insults from the general population, right? Even in the form of being ignored, right? Mm-hmm. Denying their humanity by not even seeing them and not even acknowledging their existence, right? So I think that this can be a significant part of best practices. And just to kind of speak on, two particular slides and some of the information that was shared there.
So wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing up such vital themes that contextualize this conversation so importantly around retention and also acknowledging the indigenous displacement that was the original displacement. And then this piece about lived experience as a methodology for engagement, and then also recognizing the shortage that we have in frontline staff and the need of that community to be supported and to be able to metabolize the trauma that they have secondary experiences with, or their own personal trauma. And you sort of segued us really beautifully into the next question, which I'm going to put to Berlin first, around what are effective practices to serve folks living in encampments, and how can we be culturally informed in these approaches?
Thank you. And I have to agree as well. I think having an individual who understands the struggle, who understands the culture is also important, not only because you relate to someone who looks like you, but someone who has been where you've been, trying to meet them where they're at, trying to make sure that you understand the need of the day, not the need for the week or not the need for the month, but the need for the day, trying to humanize them and see them as humans, but not individuals who are invisible or are just a stain in the community. And asking them, what is it that you need today? How can we provide the service that you need just for the day? Not, I'm just trying to make sure that, we get your basic needs met, whatever it is that the basic need is for the day, and making sure that you can provide that. And then when you say that you're going to return, that you return, that you do follow-ups, and that you try to not categorize everybody, because everybody doesn't have the same need. But like Will said, being able to provide the peer in the group, as well as doing follow-up, to me has been the best practices that we have. And not only, show them what basic needs are or try to give them or meet the basic needs, but also teaching them about mental health and self-care, trying to show them grounding techniques while you're speaking to them for the minute. But for me, it has been best practices. Thank you.
That's tremendous. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm hearing a theme of trust and trust building. I think a lot of folks may not recognize how long it takes to really build that trust to help someone to be housed. And I really appreciate what you said about what do you need today? So that piece about being where that person is and sticking with and helping and providing a context for them to sort of take the lead. And so I'd like to put that question to Colleen as well. What are effective practices for serving folks living in encampments, and how can we be culturally informed?
Such an important question. And a few years ago, I got to work actually closely with Berlin on a demonstration project we called Encampment to Home. And we wanted to demonstrate that, people who live on the streets, definitely have a lot of needs, but ultimately need housing, and that homes end homelessness. There was a lot of interest in what types of resources could be ushered in to help people in those encampments. But the one word often was not homes. It was everything else but homes. And so we wanted to demonstrate that with homes, people in encampments will move indoors as long as a few things exist. The piece that Berlin mentioned, as well as Willem, is knowing who your case manager is and having, consistent rapport building and contact with that person. And that we have the resource to move people in and those supportive services on the back end. We worked on 2 large encampments, very different, demographics look very different, but ultimately, basically every unit we had that people were eligible for was filled. We actually had a wait list, and that we had over 90% retention. We also, those that were not eligible or we just didn't have enough, we did through scattered site in permanent housing also. And same thing, retention out a year was very strong. So the mayoral debate that just happened, the first question was, is housing a human right? And if that's our answer, which I think for this group it is, I think we have to really look at our policies, our practices, and our funding to ensure that, we can provide the resources folks need today, but ultimately our collective goal is to move people from their homelessness and get them into homes just like we have, and that right is shared, and that we have a collective vision to get there, and that we move swiftly, and we move with dignity, and we move in a trauma-informed way. We released a best practices document on encampments, on what that looks like if we do need to move quickly, because some encampments, there are some big challenges around hygiene, around safety, and we do need to dig in a focused way, but we have a lot of examples of how not to do it, but this document is to show how to do it in those ways when we do. I think, though, we always, have to remember is that homelessness and unsheltered homelessness is a regional issue. So if you focus here, there is an opportunity cost that you're not focusing here. And I think that's really important, like the Venice Beach data that we saw, that you can focus on an area, but ultimately people will come back until you handle the regional issue. And it's even beyond regional, state, and nationwide. And so I think we know what it takes now. And I think it's now just the investment to make it happen. And at the work being done on the ground with people like William in Berlin and the thousands of people who are doing this work, my hat's off to them. And they've proven themselves day in, day out. When the resource is there, if you build it, they will fill it.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Just really appreciate, that the policy practice and funding piece that we have to continue to ensure and work for, and then the piece around this being a larger regional issue, and so that there's no kind of, as Randall was saying, kind of sort of like the leaf blower effect of like, well, people, this is our community as a county, and we need to kind of come around it in that way. I'd like to address this next question to William to kind of get a little bit more in depth about what it's like for people adapting to life after they've been housed. Like what are the adaptations that make it difficult for individuals to adjust to housing?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that, homelessness doesn't end once you're housed. And what that means is just because an individual, especially someone who's experienced chronic homelessness, just because that individual is now housed doesn't mean that they are suddenly free of the experience of having been homeless, right? And so that is then where we have to have a discussion as case managers or as a group, as a village, with these individuals as to how they can transcend their identification with someone who is homeless into someone who is housed. Because until that transition is made, until that transcendence happens, then even though that individual is housed, if they still identify as someone who is homeless, then that can then be a seed that then grows into recidivism. And then you may very well see that individual fall back into homelessness. So in my own approach, speaking to methodology, right, when it comes to outreach and housing retention and so forth, so much of it, when it comes to retention, has to do with assisting and supporting and guiding where possible and listening to their guidance when it comes to them deconditioning that mindset of having been homeless, of being a homeless individual, and recognizing that as a past life now, and that they have now entered a new existence of someone who is housed, and being able to identify as someone who is housed instead of someone who is still homeless, and also recognizing that they deserve to be housed, right? And as a side note to that, kind of goes to the question that I presented to everyone here on the panel and the attendees. You know, though housing is a human right, does that automatically mean that that individual feels like they belong, right? Does this person even feel like they belong in the community? Do they feel accepted in the community? Or is there still the scars from having been ostracized from society? And so they bring that then also with them into the housing experience. And so now that they're housed, if there's not a sense of acceptance, if there's not a feeling of that they belong in this community, a part of any community, well, then how does that then also inform them possibly sliding back out of that community because they never felt like they belonged in the first place? So those are some of the questions and issues that I like to address in my own practice when it comes to homeless outreach and retention. And part of my solutions to that is addressing the person's subconscious mind and really planting seeds there and giving them tools, self-messaging that they can give themselves, that they can tell themselves, to then instill a sense that they belong and they are deserving of housing and so forth, and that they needn't fall back into old practices that could lead to them being back out on the street, back out in the tent, back out in the car and so forth, because it's extremely easy for them to do so. Soon as things start going wrong, soon as there's any type of like bumps in the road or any type of, you start hearing it from them, right? Oh, I'd rather be back out of my car than deal with this. Or, oh, I was safer back out in and so on and so forth. You hear it from them. You know, they're giving you these warning signs. And so paying attention to that, it's them responding with, don't end a negative sentence. You know, these are other terms and messages and so forth that you can use to help to build yourself up and to have confidence in your own ability to stay housed and to remain in housing. Approaching it from the mind perspective, right? And then I also like to introduce diet as well. You know, you're housed now. You have a refrigerator. You have this and that. You know, let's utilize, you know, these basic amenities to your advantage, right? Let's talk about diet. Let's talk about health, right? Let's talk about physical and mental health. Let's talk about spiritual health, right? And how these various factors can really help to empower an individual, which then helps to support them in staying housed, right? And to respond to issues and challenges that may arise in a manner that is non-self-destructive and can actually help them come out of these experiences feeling stronger and more confident in their ability to stay housed and then move forward. What are your goals, right? What are your 6-month goals, right? What would you like to study? Would you like to go back to school? So on and so forth, right? Employment can be crucial and critical, right? You know, let's talk about employment. If you haven't had a job, let's talk about job training, right? Because employment, having a 9-to-5, you know, as dull or droning as most folks may think about it, employment is medicine as well. Housing is housing is medicine, right? Housing is medicine, but then also employment can be medicine as well, because that can give, that's continuity, right? That's giving them somewhere to go every single day, certain amount of hours and so forth. It pays them and it helps to develop a pattern, because when you're homeless, so many things are up and down. There's no stability, right? That's one of the foundational fundamental markers of homelessness. There is zero stability, right? Things are always up in the air. Things are always changing, right? So to provide the individual with various sources where there is pattern, where there is continuity, where they can count on something and so forth, and further help to instill within their mind and their psyche, okay, this happens then, this happens there, so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to further reinforce this concept that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. Because when you're homeless, it's G, H, Z, A, so on and so forth. So I think that those are some important components when it comes to bringing someone from interim housing from the streets into permanent housing and housing retention specifically.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I thank you so much. And I'd like to give Berlin a chance to answer that question too before we go into Q&A. So I'm cueing you, audience. Please share any questions in the Q&A box so that we can transition to Q&A. But Berlin, please, your response to how to support people that have experienced unsheltered homelessness.
I think when you look at it, at every individual in their traumas and trying to be trauma centered, and just understanding what their experience has been in the street, how long they've been in the street, how have they felt like they haven't been able to, or when did they feel that they haven't been able to complete a task, walking them through that, showing them what life looks like outside of homelessness, taking them shopping and giving them the money in hand so they could know what it is to purchase food, how to get on the bus again, what it is to pay rent, what it is to look at a unit for the first time, humanizing them again to understand what you do on a day-to-day task, which is not being an encampment, which is most of the time when you sit and you talk to your clients, they tell you their day-to-day routine, and breaking them off from their day-to-day routine to just show them just a little bit of what is different. And being able to provide also intensive case management that, with housing, and learning that when you house them, when you rehouse them again, they're not out of homelessness, like Will said, being able to understand that and meeting them where they're at. And like I always say, when you house them is like opening a can of worms again, and figuring out how to how to find them, how to allow them to find their own place again in their own home, and whatever home that means, either interim housing or permanent housing or shared housing, and the different various housing models that we have now. All models don't meet one person. Each model meets the need of each individual person who has with their own experiences. We have individuals who've been incarcerated for so long that certain settings don't work. We have individuals who have their own particular traumas of having their own apartment, so the apartment won't work. So being able to meet them there and understand that all models don't meet everybody. That's it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such an important piece is to, understanding that everyone has different needs. I think you said earlier, and not every model meets everyone's needs. And I just want to reiterate some of the themes, a sense of belonging, that really stood out to me. People are familiar with John Powell's work on othering and belonging over at Berkeley, Othering Institute, I believe. And so just thinking about that in the context also is of race, and, how systems have instilled this feeling of othering and for many people of color. And I appreciate too naming your work as a practice. Just like our work around, developing our own anti-racist practices. It's a practice, it's ongoing, we're learning, we're listening. And the self-messaging and the grounding techniques that you mentioned earlier, Berlin, and also taking into account the warning signs, I think was really important. And so I'd like to turn to Q&A. I'm looking in the Q&A box. I just want to read this comment I would just like to share my experience with you. I have worked with homeless people for about 8 years, and it was very frustrating to see that they are offered a lot of resources, but most of the times they're not committed to their own case. They do not want to have responsibilities. I think it goes two ways, help me to help you. I do not want to sound mean, but this is the reality I've seen. I'd like our panel to respond to that comment.
I think sometimes as case managers, because I've been a case manager and I've been a therapist for the unsheltered population for a little bit over 8 years. And I feel like sometimes we're more invested than our own clients. And that's why I kept saying today, we have to meet them where they're at. We have to meet their need, not our need. And you do the work, you do the work and you do everything that they want. And then the last minute, they're not ready. And it's not when we're ready, it's when they are. And again, I think we go back to the point where we're here to service them, not them to service us. And I think sometimes we get caught up on how much work have we done. We've done A through Z, and yet we still don't get to the finish line to house them. And as a previous case manager, I know the frustration because I think we've all been there. But sitting back and sometimes acknowledging that there's 101 reasons why our clients aren't ready to go indoors. And there has a lot, behind all that, there's a lot of trauma, and trying to meet the trauma need first. That's why I think we're rolling into this new era where we're trying to be trauma centered first before we do anything. And I mean, I agree with the housing first model as well, but when you do the groundwork and your boots on the ground, it's completely different for when you put it on paper and trying to, meet the I think when we talk about data and trying to meet data and trying to make sure that our work reflects, that our data reflects our work, it's completely different when you do the one-on-one work. And I go back to humanizing, and we have to humanize the person we're working with and understand that if they're not ready today, there's 100,000 other people homeless. Let's meet the other person and come back and meet the need whenever it is that they're ready to go indoors. And I do understand. I mean, I do hear I do hear it. I've been there before, and but those are my.
Thank you. Go ahead, Colleen. Did you want to respond?
Yeah. I think part of the challenge too is also what we have to offer may not align with what somebody wants. And I think we have to be very honest about that, that our wants and desires may not align, but also what's in our toolkit may not be in alignment too. And so it's, I think, being very conscious. And that's why I really enjoyed the presentation that documented what people want. So when people say they're resistant to congregate shelter, it's not that they're resistant to that. And the reasons why I think have been beautifully, elucidated. So I think, part of it is time. I think with society othering you and telling you you're not worth a lot of these resources, you start to internalize that. And also trauma tells you and cheats you into believing that your existence right now is okay. And so part of our work is to, do stages of change and try to show the alternative. A lot of it's trust too. If somebody's offering you something, they may not trust what you're doing. What you're offering is legit. I'm originally from New York, and trust is something that's baked in native New Yorkers. So it just takes time. And in so many cases, somebody who said no, and as some of the folks who may have said no 50 times, the 51st time, because we were there at the right time, we got the yes. And it was also because we were offering the thing that they desired, they needed, and they had built up rapport, and the person offering it was trusted. So it can be frustrating, but I do remind myself, as Berlin said, it's not about me, it's about them.
Excellent points. William, did you, I want to give you a chance to respond to that question or the comment before moving on to the next one?
Sure. I think that in this field of work, as other fields of work, but especially in these particular cases or with such individuals, it's important for us to work free of expectation. When expectation is involved, then we're just rolling out the red carpet for disappointment, right? So working free of expectation, at least as case managers or in anyone who works in this particular field, can be its own kind of source of support in our ability to effectively manage and respond and deal with the various individuals and their circumstances and their resistance to whatever we see or analyze or feel may be the next logical step in their ability to progress and move forward towards housing. So being free of expectation is definitely paramount in terms of a personal practice that we can have in the field and in this work.
So appreciated. Okay, and this question was in the chat addressed to William, but I welcome others, Colleen and Berlin, to answer. And we're kind of coming toward the end of our Q&A. I knew it was going to happen so fast. Do you see a place for the general public to assist in providing the type of support you've described through day-to-day interactions, their discussions of the issue, or structured interaction?
Yeah, so when I was chair of the homelessness committee, right, for neighborhood council, and we would have these meetings, right, where the general public was invited to come and share their thoughts, and just seeing some of the vitriol that individuals from the community had towards individuals experiencing homelessness, it told me that, I think one of the reasons you have so much NIMBYism, both here and throughout the United States, it seems, is that people want homeless individuals removed from their line of sight, right? They want them removed to a place where they don't have to see them, think about them, and so forth. Because if they do, and if they get to know these individuals and their story and what led to them being homeless, this may then lead to them understanding that they too can become homeless, right? And I think a lot of individuals, based on the responses I heard from some of these folks, and just analyzing that, they don't want to believe that they or their family members could be on the streets as well. And so to avoid that realization, they would rather the homeless just simply be removed from their line of sight in general, if that makes sense, right? So in other words, it's easier to have the homeless subtracted from your community, from your purview, from your perception, to reinforce an idea that this could never be you, this could never be your story, right? Because if you got to know these individual stories, then you may realize how similar it may be to your own and having been housed, and where it could also possibly lead, you see? And they're afraid of that. So, and they don't want to believe that that could then be their future as well. So to answer, going back to your question, I think that as far as the community involvement and so forth, it's, one, humanizing individuals by even just simply, when you see an individual, saying hello, saying good morning, respond to them should they, present with that and so forth. Even if you have nothing to offer, you can still offer a hello, right? You can still offer a good morning. You can still offer a good evening, right? Should the individual present with that? Should the individual lead with that, meaning the homeless individual? Yes. People who are in general outreach groups, such as in Koreatown, right? You got Cape Town for All. So that just started amongst a group of individuals in that community in response to the protests against the bridge housing site at 7th and Vermont, right? So it could just be you in a group or as an individual doing your own outreach, right? Someone once said, there's no such thing as leftovers, right? If you've had a meal, a banquet, and so forth, and you got food left over, go and see who is experiencing homelessness around your building, in your neighborhood, down the street, and offer it to them, right? Don't let that go to the garbage. Offer that to those that are experiencing homelessness around you, right? And then for those that may be, teachers, students, in schools and so forth, just being mindful and having these open conversations, around homelessness and so forth, and making sure that individuals know that there are routes and opportunities for you to be approached should they know or they themselves be experiencing homelessness, right? Because you got a lot of individuals who may be experiencing homelessness, but they don't want to express that. They don't want to share that because of the stigmatism attached to it, right? You're basically a criminal. Right? So, creating spaces and opportunities where individuals can share if they are experiencing that, engaging in those around you without having it to necessarily be forced, but simply in a more casual manner, right? You have things left over, going out and sharing it with them, right? And also those individuals out on the street are looking for resources, right? Should a conversation open up when you go to yield them some food or water and so forth, then just going back to whatever opportunities may exist in terms of agencies and organizations that work in this professionally to then match them with those particular resources. So it could be done in a casual manner. And these are, some opportunities in which, just the average individual or group can engage in those who are experiencing homelessness within their immediate vicinity.
So helpful and practical. I just want to give Colleen and Berlin an opportunity to answer that question real quick before we start to close out.
Yeah, I think everything that William said, I think just a big piece is understanding the structural issues that lead to homelessness. A lot of people, are aware homelessness is an issue in their community, but aren't aware of the why. And I think are frankly a little scared to dig into the whys because it requires some self-reflection on privilege and why some people, why some remain housed and others do not. And I think that's, we have to look at our history, our own privilege, and what we can do for those of us who come from a place of privilege, how we can use that to advocate for policies and practices and resources in our own communities. Awareness is it, voting, being active in your local politics. I think there's a lot of focus on the national level, which is important, and international, but know who your council member is, your mayor, LA is a little complicated. We have 88 cities, we have board of supervisor, jurisdictionally, but if you ever have a question, I can probably tell you. But it's important to know and be active and advocate for those structural things. We frankly focus on what our community perceives as personal people's failures. And I urge them to look at the broader failures of our system and those of us who have been in a place to make those policies and practices. So that is my ask of everyone is look up who is in your community making those decisions and reach out to them and tell them what you think and what you value. Thank you.
I think for me, one of the biggest things that, I agree with what Will and Colleen said, but I think it starts with us, right? It starts with educating our friends or educating our family members, being friendly to our unhoused neighbors outside of our houses. I would like to see probably educators have these conversations in a broader perspective and educating the next generation on what homelessness is and the many factors that they come with. Because I often hear the parents or the adults talk about how disgusted they are to have unsheltered individuals outside of their homes. So I think it starts with us. And if we can change our lens and how we see and how we speak, then we could change the next generation that comes, as well as, like Colleen said, getting involved with the cities that you live in to see what the politicians are doing to change the stigma or change the policies around homelessness is key. But again, I think it just starts with us.
Wow, what a beautiful place to kind of conclude this idea that it starts with us. And I just really have learned so much from each of you, and of course the presentations earlier. And I just want to offer our sincere gratitude for your work in this space, and the compassion expressed, and the real passion that you have for being in service to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And I, again, just want to thank our audience for joining us today. It was such a large group of you, and appreciate the excellent conversations in the chat. And now we are rounding out to end a little bit early. So I'm going to pass it back to Gary to close us out.
Thank you, Saba. And I just wanted to express my gratitude toward all the panelists who have been here today to provide deep nuance on the set of issues that we face as it relates to moving people who are currently unsheltered to being housed. I know that just a stark contrast to reading the LA Times article that cited the RAND study. What did I learn from that article? Well, I learned, 0.05% of the facts and the detailed information that actually existed. And in fact, in only providing that information in the LA Times article, I know that I missed the point, which for me as a researcher, it was fine. I went ahead and clicked on the RAND article, which was available to read it in full, but I recognize that not everybody is able to do that. And so I do encourage those who participated today to share the symposium. We will put it up on our website soon, and perhaps can help inform those people who are voters, who are concerned about their unhoused neighbors but don't know what to do, and can respond to some of the kind of scare tactics that we're seeing in some of our politicians with care and compassion, and ultimately with progress. So with that, I want to close our symposium today, and I look forward to connecting with all of you in the future, whether online or in person. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.